Well, welcome back to the Comic Book Historians Podcast with Alex Grant and Jim Thompson. Today we have a very special guest, Kim Munson. Now, Kim is the editor of Comic Art and Museum Anthology and the exhibition catalogs Dual Views, Labor Landmarks of San Francisco, and On Reflection, The Art of Margaret Harrison, as well as many contributions to academic books, journals, magazines, and other publications. She is also the co-curator with her cohort, Trina Robbins, at the Society of Illustrators Museum in New York, the Women in Comics Looking Forward and Back exhibition. Kim, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
You were born in Michigan?
In northern Michigan, in a really small town. I'll use my handy map. I'm like right here on Lake Michigan. It was gorgeous, surrounded by national forest and everything else, but it was also a factory town. So my parents were both, blue collar union members. Because of that, I actually wrote about union labels for a while in the labor movement. Anyway, I moved to LA in like 79. I worked in the film industry as a scenic artist for about 10 years for NBC. And I worked on Tales from the Dark Side and a bunch of like really bad canon films. And then I married a musician and moved up to San Francisco. And I was the president of the NARIS chapter up here. I worked in the music business for a long time. And I was a production person for Winterland Productions, the big t-shirt company. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I worked as a creative director for a bunch of .coms. I went back to school at San Francisco State after the crash and got a master's in art history and started writing about comics.
Now, when you went to get your master's, were you thinking you would go and get your PhD, or what was your thoughts in terms of going back to school?
Well, I had never finished my BA. I started working right away and went from like one thing to the other. So it actually was a whole thing because I had to finish my GE and my BA, and then I stayed on for my master's.
I see.
And at the time, when I decided that I was going to write my master's about comics, San Francisco State had no idea that this was a real field. This was like in 2008 that I was doing my thesis. So, I brought in like the Masters of American Comics catalog and a couple copies of the International Journal of Comic Art. And there were some books of theory out already. There were a couple that were really good. So I was able to convince them that, yes, this is a topic that people actually write about. And, there were some strange demands, but I actually wound up writing what was kind of the beginning of my book about High and Low and Masters of Comics and that whole group that came together to do that. The Brian Walker, Spiegelman, John Carlin, and Philbin kind of group that came together.
Now, was that also your thesis also influenced your Comic Art and Museums book that's currently out?
Yeah, actually, I kind of think of my Comic Art and Museums book as kind of what I wish I had when I was in grad school. So it's got like the opening chapter has a little bit of theory about like how differently comics are perceived when they're on the wall instead of on the page. It has a nice thing by Brian Walker that kind of lays out like who all of the famous artists are and why they're famous or important. And like kind of the real tools that cartoonists use. And then the overview is by Dennis Kitchen, who kind of does like this whole soup to nuts, like at the beginning of my career, comics were nothing. And now here we are,
Yeah, so, I want to talk about the comics on the wall stuff when we get to the more theoretical stuff after we get through sort of a chronology. But I want to go back to the very beginning for a minute. I had read that your dad had given you Wonder Woman and Captain America comics to get you interested in figure drawing.
Yeah.
Was that because you showed some artistic, like they're blue collar, they're working in this town? What made him think to do that for you?
There were a lot of artists in the family. Actually, my dad was kind of, even though he had a big ego about it, he was kind of an amateur, I hate to say. But his older sister, my aunt, actually owned an art school in Beverly Hills. She was married to a silent film star named Monty Blue, who was like in the Lillian Gish era. And he was really well known. He actually has a star on the Walk of Fame at Hollywood and Vine. When I lived in LA, I used to go visit his star all the time.
Oh, that's awesome.
Oh, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So originally the idea was that, I would learn and then I would spend the summers with her at her art school, which I did quite a lot. And then, as time went on, when I got older, I moved out to LA and worked as a scenic artist.
So was that because your dad wanted something different or more for you than that blue collar life that they were doing, or just because it was an interest?
They didn't. They were always scheming to move, and it never quite worked out. So the idea was that I was supposed to be famous and finance their big move.
Yeah. I lived in Michigan for a year, and it's everyone I talked to, it was all about, we're going to move someday. But
yeah. Well, it's a famous place to be from. I mean, Madonna left and all kinds of people left. I don't know. When I was growing up there, since it was heavily union, it was very progressive. So, to read about the politics that are going on now and the protests against masks and all the open carry and all, it's just, that never would have happened when I was growing up there.
So you're one of those people that have lived in both Los Angeles and in San Francisco. I assume you're happier in San Francisco currently?
Yeah, I actually tried to moved to LA briefly again for business reasons. And it just wasn't, Mark and I have a beautiful house overlooking the Pacific Ocean. And it's just gorgeous. We're like 12 miles from San Francisco, and we have like kind of the best of both worlds. I'm really happy here. LA is just a giant freeway. It's just spread out everywhere, and I just never connected with it again. The last time I moved there in like the early 90s, and because I was still married to my ex-husband and I had a lot of music business connections, and it was just a disaster. We got divorced down there, and that was it.
Oh, I'll ask you later who your lawyer was and some of the professional interest. Okay, let's talk about, and I'm going to hand you over to Alex in just a minute to talk about the key exhibitions and museums. Okay. But I, in terms of the formulation of the book, I'm curious about something. In terms of comic art museums, what made you decide to do it as an anthology instead of a straight narrative authored by you?
How this kind of developed was I had an idea to do this book for a long time, and through my own research, I had started to put together the chronology of sort of the different waves of comics in and out of museums.
Yes.
And so culturally, that was very interesting to me about how it tied into all the other major art movements and that kind of thing.
And I've heard papers that you've done. So, I mean, I know.
Yeah. This particular book, what happened was Brian Walker was contacted by Mississippi Press about doing a book himself, and he didn't have time to do it, but he was like, well, Kim had been sending around this proposal for a while, and I think you should give her a shot. So originally it started out like me and Brian talking about this, and then I have other friends that write, and I thought that the whole idea of being able to show how public things like reviews and art critics and fan response really kind of shaped our ideas about what's museum quality and what's good comic art. So I wanted the original voices in there. Me citing it just wasn't enough to me. So I brought in this whole group of people. Plus, I wanted expertise in areas I'm not an expert in. John Lent wrote a great article about the comic art gallery in Dubai, for instance. Another scholar, Jacqueline Burdett, wrote a great essay about like sort of the evolution of comics in museums in Japan. I would have no idea. So, I also made it an anthology to get expertise from other people in areas that I couldn't tell the story.
It's funny that you bring that up, because that was one of my favorite things about the book were the critiques of exhibits by people like Clement Greenberg and the Manny Farber quotes. I'm a big fan of Manny Farber, and that was fantastic.
This whole essay is really amazing
because he's so smart. In terms of animation and other things, the way he writes about it.
So one thing I really enjoyed about the book was it was essentially chronology of comic art present or exhibited in museums that went back, close to 100 years. And then you mentioning them, having like the program books for some of them, then having articles or essays of people that were there at the time that had some impression of those events. So it was like this really nice history looked at from a few different angles of museums that exhibited comic art. And I thought that was, I don't think anyone else has done that before. So it was definitely new for me. And I never really quite thought of it in that way. And it put a lot of things in context for me of just original comic art pages and how they can be presented to the public on an education and enlightenment standpoint. And just going back, you got, you even have as far back as in 1933, Cleveland Museum of Art, contemporary work by cartoonists and caricaturists, and yet there was work by Cliff Sterrett, Polly and Her Pals. I love that strip. And then Dr. Seuss even. So how did you go about, finding out about some of this stuff? I mean, is this like internet searches? How are you finding this stuff? And were you like, wow, that's when you discovered these things?
Well, part of it was internet searches, but I also did archival research in a lot of places. I went to the Billy Ireland and looked through a lot of files. Like I had no idea when I went to the Billy Ireland that Milt Caniff would end up being one of the stars of the book. I originally went because I knew that they had the Cartoonist Society files, and I knew that the Cartoonist Society did a lot of shows around like the New York World's Fair and stuff. And that was what I was really looking for. But then I was looking at the Caniff files and I was like, oh my God, he started exhibiting in like
so many things.
Yeah. So and he was really a pioneer. So that was like, one of those archival treasures,
of discovering.
So I went to 3 different departments at the Met and looked through their files about shows in the 30s and 40s because I'd seen in there.
I was really surprised by how they even had the Metropolitan Museum of Art 1939 exhibited with some Walt Disney Snow White production.
They bought their first animation cell in 1939. And the Times did this great article about it that was actually really kind of forward thinking about like sort of animation and what it means and the whole, memory of, the vultures looking down at Snow White, like what they were thinking. And, it was, and Disney's comments about it were really interesting because he was kind of like, being very macho and like, oh, art, I don't think about that.
He wasn't really buying into the interpretation aspect of that, but it was interesting but they celebrated it and analyzed it anyway, right?
Yeah, well, and the museum actually took the view that it was like a craftsman workshop kind of thing, sort of like, a lot of the Renaissance artists had their workshop where there were like 6 artists working and Rembrandt would come and put a little swatch on something, they kind of looked at it the same way where it was like the workshop of Disney. So that was really interesting. And the Met actually kept displaying Disney off and on for quite a long time.
Yeah, and it's interesting to kind of put Walt Disney and Milton Caniff kind of in a similar origination point, because then in 1939, Milton Caniff, like you mentioned, he had an exhibition in the Dayton Art Center and also in New York, and there was press coverage, because I don't think a lot of people know that Milton Caniff and his Terry and the Pirates was such a big deal. But he aged Terry in real time, and he would use cinematic techniques. He'd portray different genres based on the storyline. It'd be romance, war, whatever. He was an artistic pioneer, and he put a lot of cinematic features in comic art. But then to actually see him take it seriously to the point of him exhibiting all throughout the 40s and early 50s.
The Billy Ireland has the pieces that he displayed in that show in New York.
Yeah.
That still have the labels on the back.
Oh,
and
cool.
they were like Asian studies. There were some very moody, sort of shadowy, mysterious looking things. It was fascinating. So Caniff, after getting all that press and everything, he started a tour of his own of Terry and the Pirates. And starting in 1946, he sent what started out as sort of the making of a Sunday page with all the plates and everything. After it traveled for a little while, he got suggestions from curators and added more stuff. And by the end, it was a huge show that toured to like 20 or 30 different places. And then the NCS started, and he started coordinating exhibits for the NCS, and those toured all over and kind of culminated with a big tour for the Treasury Department for savings bonds in 1949,
right?
And a show at the Met of American cartooning.
Do you feel like he almost elevated some of his fellow cartoonists that were in the National Cartoonist Society to like also kind of encourage them to showcase their art as a finer art? Do you feel like he kind of elevated where they were too? Was he a pioneer in this for them?
Yeah, he definitely was. And I think, well, so the cartoonists didn't like curate, it was sort of like they just wanted as many of their members as they could to participate. They didn't really curate. This was one of the things that eventually kind of was an issue in the 1951 Met show, was all of the art critics really wanted them to like curate and pick the best. And they really wanted like a democratic kind of representation of all of their members. So it was like a huge show, and some of it was awful and some of it was great. But I think that Caniff and Alex Raymond were probably the biggest drivers of the style then. Brian Walker actually writes about this quite a lot in his comics history book, that he, when it got to the point where Terry and the Pirates and Steve Canyon and all of Alex Raymond's strips were really popular. So many people were emulating their style that they were really influential.
Can you, while you're talking about the Caniff, can you talk about Julien Levy just for a minute? Because I found that really interesting, that he seemed important and visionary a bit.
He did a very influential book in 1924 called The Seven Lively Arts.
Oh, wow.
He wrote this book and became the head of programming at CBS, and he was involved in a whole bunch of exhibitions. The reason I bring him up is the guy that owned that gallery, Julien Levy, read this book and decided he was really into surrealism and had a big gallery and everything. But he also included like ballet and comics and like all kinds of like pop culture art that he treated as high-end artwork. And he managed to get a couple frames from Disney's, there's a short called like The Three Little Wolves or The Three Bad Wolves or something like that. Yeah. Well, anyway, so he managed to get two shorts into an early Museum of Modern Art show that was about Dada. and they used some very abstract cells from this short. But he was the one that really, I suspect that he's the one that actually sold the Met the Snow White print too, because he had a show of cells, which was really unusual in 1938.
Yeah, that's great. And well, it sounds like he was kind of a futurist or a pioneer in that sense, as far as appreciating what's going on around him.
Well, I'm grateful there for eBay, because someone who was an assistant at the gallery actually wrote a history of that gallery with a lot of citations and everything. So I was able to track that down on eBay and actually have a more in-depth view of that gallery and that guy.
Yeah, that is great. And then just to finalize on Caniff before we talk about an earlier thing from this, but his work was even shown, you mentioned, in the 1964 New York World's Fair also. And that was such a cultural event, and that his work being included in that, I think, is a testament to how influential he was just in general. I think a lot of Americans were reading his stuff from Taming the Pirates all the way through Steve Canyon. So it's kind of cool to, I've never looked at the original art museum aspect of him until your book. But then also in 1942, the comic strip Ancient and Honorable Lineage at the National Arts Club, New York. It was for the American Institute of Graphic Arts. And this is interesting because they talk about the origin of sequential art. Gaines has an essay that he writes about the history of comics. Tell us about that. And it seemed like they talk about comic strips and comic books. Tell us about that exhibit.
Well, that show was actually one of the things that really started me on my research too. I saw the Bill Gaines article early on, so it was one of the clues that I had that there were shows farther back than, when Masters of Comics came out, we used to see headlines in 2005, this is the first show of comics ever, and I knew that wasn't right. So I did a real treasure hunt on this one because Bill Gaines, I guess because this essay was originally published as like a brochure for the show, it never occurred to him to put the actual name of the show in the article. So I had to really do a lot of tracing just to find out what the show was.
Yeah, just to even connect it to it. Yeah,
it happened. He mentioned the museum in New York. I can't remember right now what the name of it is, but he mentioned it, and they happened to have their archives in the Smithsonian database. So I went to the DeYoung Museum and looked at their version of the database and found all the newsletters from the National Arts Guild. That's what it was. And then I found out later that a female illustrator at the time curated this show, and she was a real anomaly for the time. She did like silhouette drawings for Ladies' Home Journal and stuff like that. But she was inspired by Mayan panels, that she was impressed by the storytelling and how sequential art could tell a story. So she started tracing the history, and in 1942, she mounted the show. I went to the American Graphic Art Institute's headquarters in New York and looked through their archives and found more info about it and the original poster, which was pretty cool.
That's cool to find the posters and things too.
As far as I know, this was the first one that actually had the history and showed, originals from like the collection of the Rare Books Department at the New York City Public Library. And it had originals of like Japanese scrolls and Mayan panels and, broadsheets and all kinds of stuff. Then it had like contemporary comic strips. And it was the first show that I know of that actually showed comic books. They had More Fun, and they had the first issue of Wonder Woman. They had Superman and all, and they had a display from South America because Brazil was like a major market during the wartime.
And Kim, was this original art by like people like Wilhelm Busch and Doré and like some of the European people that preceded the development of it in the U.S.?
Yeah.
I mean, that's fantastic. And just to be clear, this, after it closed there, it went on a national tour. So it went throughout the country.
It went to a lot of different places, and I haven't like absolutely confirmed this because I haven't seen a checklist, but I'm like 90% sure that they reformed this show and it toured with that Treasury Department thing and was at the Library of Congress in 1949 and traveled around the country with the NCS for that tour.
And the reason why I ended the kind of this early part at 1964 with that World's Fair is pretty much then there's a division point now in how comic art is treated in museums. And I noticed you had mentioned that it was really because of Lichtenstein and Warhol and having comic art in museums, but almost like their version of other people's comic panels. And then it came off as fine art and being sold for a lot of money. But there was a division point culturally now where now suddenly, because there's a high value amount of dollars being bought on it, and there is some cultural event here. Describe how that changes, how there's a cultural shift now with how comic art is viewed in museums.
Well, there's two things there. Let me just really quickly talk about the 64 World's Fair, because the NCS actually launched an exhibit at the World's Fair that toured for like 20 years called Cavalcade of Comics.
Yeah.
And they also had their version of pop art where they spoofed their own cartoons, pop art style, in the restaurant at the top of the park.
There you go.
So, and Milt Caniff actually had in a couple different Asian pavilions, they actually had like Steve Canyon Day. So they had a big presence. There was a closed circuit TV for the thing. Milt Caniff designed a whole stage for them to do chalk drawings and everything. It was really fascinating. I hope to write a more in-depth article about the World's Fair. So going on through the 60s and pop art and everything, one of the most important shows that happened around that period was at the Louvre in 1967.
Yes.
It was actually the Museum of Decorative Arts, which is part of the Louvre. But the French, there was a group of French fans that really, really wanted to exhibit comics. And their idea of replying to pop art was to do photographic blow-ups of panels, like really big, like painting size, so that people could really appreciate the drawings. And they really admired Bern Hogarth and Caniff and Alex Raymond. Those were like their three, and Crazy Cat, you know, those were like their idols. So there were huge blow-ups of these very dramatic panels. And that French show actually toured around all over Europe for a couple years. And in the UK, there was a show of original art that really influenced a lot of UK critics, like Paul Gravett and people that grew up to be very important comics people. The catalog for that show, for the French show, was very influential in the US when it was republished as a history of the comic strip. You guys have probably seen that. It was... it kind of gave, people started to get really interested in original comic art again after the pop art thing. And university galleries were really interested because underground comics were such a big thing then. Yeah. So they showed classic comic strips and they showed underground comics, and the catalog kind of gave them some theory to work with so that they could actually like have an intellectual underpinning. And it kind of relaunched comics in museums in the 70s. Yeah.
Now on the underground comics, are you talking about like Bob Stewart's Fonus Balonus?
That was the first show.
That's the first one. Yeah.
That was solely underground comics. That was the first show at the
And I was actually impressed by the list because you have Von Baudet, you have Robert Crumb, Larry Hama, actually, who created G.I. Joe of all things, and then Art Spiegelman, and they were even looking at well, did I read that right? They've been looking at Kirby's New Gods art a little bit too in that one.
Not in that show. No,
That'd be a later one.
they were all kind of that show that I just mentioned in the UK.
Yeah.
They were all together in that show.
Okay.
They brought some underground comics, and New Gods was like the sensation of that show, like hot off Kirby's drawing board. Yeah.
That's cool. Now, the early 70s, it's interesting because now it seems like there's some after effects of the pop art stuff, then underground comic art. So there's a Judith O'Sullivan's The Art of the Comic Strip at the University of Maryland in 71. From 1974 to 2002, you have the Museum of Cartoon Art by Mort Walker, run by his son Brian Walker, whom you mentioned, from 74 to 92, and he also curated many shows. It started out at Connecticut, ended in Florida. Rick Marshall contributed a lot of comic art to those shows. And Jim and I spoke with Rick and how he was friends with Ernie McGee and how he got a lot of comic art from that. So it may have been from that collection. But tell us about the significance of the Walker Museum.
The formulation of the Walker Museum was after the World's Fair show, it toured for a while. And in 1966, the show Cavalcade of Comics was at the Smithsonian. And the original art that was touring with it, they donated to the Smithsonian and refreshed it with new art. This started a dialogue with like sort of the arts part of the government to have a permanent comics museum, which they were trying to do at the Kennedy Center at the time. And there were long negotiations going on about it. And somewhere in the middle of this, Mort Walker was inspired to start a museum of his own just to show like the work that he had. Mm-hmm. So they moved into this, a castle-like structure in the Mead Mansion,
right,
in Connecticut. And this wound up being both a museum and the NCS meeting place because so many of the cartoonists lived around that area. So they did the first retrospectives of artists like Eisner and Crazy Cat, and they did a lot of themed stuff where it was the first show of Marvel ever.
That's cool.
Lots of really interesting stuff. I've actually got in my book, I actually reproduced Brian's list of all the shows they did because it was they had so many firsts. They had the first show of women's comics, actually. Mm-hmm. Brian had read Trina's first history of women cartoonists and invited her to do a show. Brian and Trina really disagree about this because Trina says that she confronted Mort Walker about it and Mort wanted to have the show.
Yeah.
Brian really ran the museum. So it could be like any combination of those.
Sure.
That's a thing between them.
Yeah.
But looking at the list, they had the first Hal Foster exhibit. They had the first Jack Kirby exhibit.
Yeah.
They had Dick Tracy. They had editorial cartoons. Just like an amazing selection of stuff.
Yeah, it's amazing.
This was all like in 1975.
In 1975, actually. Okay, that first Jack Kirby one was 1975?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And then in 88, the Cartoon Art Museum starts. And then in 1990, tell us about the significance of the Museum of Modern Art's High and Low, Modern Art and Popular Culture brought together. It was supposed to bring together dialogue of fine art and low comic art, commercial art. Tell us what that show was trying to do. Did it succeed or fail?
Before the show happened with the old guard of the museum, there was like a sort of modern art industry that grew up around it that really made a living off of all of the lucrative pop art and all of the like abstract expressionist art like Pollock and Rothko and those kind of people. So the Museum of Modern Art was really like still like dimly lit for contemplation. So you would come up to a Rothko and it would have like one spotlight on it and you were supposed to stand there in the hallway and meditate on it.
And you have to meditate MoMA.
Yeah.
MoMA.
But that's kind of what the idea was. So when Adam Gopnik was promoted to be the new director. He wanted to shake things up a little bit and bring the museum out of this cocoon, sort of,
Right.
and modernize. So he was trying to show sort of the roots of a lot of the masterpieces that they had in terms of comics that they were based on, or advertising they were based on, or, whatever. There were 4 or 5 categories in the show. But it wasn't really enough to make everybody happy. A lot of the critics were like, what about movies? What about this? What about that?
Yeah.
Spiegelman had a famous cartoon review of it where he just listed a whole bunch of people that were in the show, including himself, and really like, Lichtenstein is dead art. What are you guys doing? And, so there was a big debate. One of the things that I point out in my book is that part of the problem is the scale of rooms of the galleries of like the Museum of Modern Art are really designed to show huge paintings. So when you show comics, they look, they're like dwarfed,
Yeah.
So
small.
One thing that pissed everybody off is they wanted to show Crumb and Philip Guston together, who's in the news right now with the National Gallery. But at that time, they wanted to show these together, and Guston's paintings are huge. They're like as big as this wall behind me. And Crumb's, comic pages. So they showed some comic books and they showed some comic pages, but there was no attempt to really equalize them. They didn't do any blow-ups or details or anything that would equalize them. So everybody looked at this and they're like, oh God, it's source material again, and this sucks, and they're putting us down. And it really motivated a whole bunch of people to become evangelists for comic art and making sure that comics had their own shows.
That comics have a fair shake in all this.
Yeah. So that was actually the Masters of American Comics in 2005 really kind of had its genesis as a response to this show.
As a response.
That was kind of why.
So tell us, and in between that, there was, I'm just going to throw it out there, but let's focus on Masters a bit. 1992 to 1999, Kevin Eastman had his Words Pictures Museum. Also, that was in the 90s. Ninja Turtles was big then also. But then tell us about the 2005 Masters of American Comics. At the Hammer, they had comic strips, and then at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, they had comic books. Tell us about that show.
Yeah, so in the two museums, it was actually like the evolution of those two things. So they because of the design of it and doing the two museums, they decided to limit it to 15 artists because they wanted to have mini galleries for each artist and really show like a really wide range of that artist's work. So, most of them had really long careers. So they wanted to show like from beginning to end, like, what their work was like and how it evolved and what the importance of it was. And they wanted to be able to identify, what it was about them that was like the thing that really differentiated and established them, that made everybody else like kind of have to follow them afterward. So the controversy about the show was there were no women. The only person of color was George Harriman. And, people, fans and in the press, just what ifed it forever, like, what about so-and-so? What about so-and-so? Linda Berry came up like every time. And it was just a very interesting situation because it was the first really big budget, like full on big budget museum show to get that kind of press and have like this big blockbuster lines around the block kind of presentation. But it was also like really controversial because of the choices they made. I mean, most people would agree with, yes, the people that are in the show are masters of comics, but there were so many people missing that everybody was like, where is so-and-so? So
Sure.
that was like everybody's favorite guessing game. I would talk about masters of comics at conferences years later, and people would still stay in the audience and argue about the choices in the show.
Right.
It was very confusing, and I was there. I took all my students there, and I also saw it in Milwaukee when it went there, which was very different because there it was all in one space.
It was all in one space, and a lot of people wouldn't let their work tour.
Yeah.
So it was like a condensed version. And then in New York, it was really different because they had a big argument about how the show would be split between the Jewish Museum in New York and in Newark.
Sure.
And they kept kind of like redesigning the show so that they would have like, they kind of figured that there would be no cross-pollination between Newark and New York, that people wouldn't see both of them. So they were trying to figure out how to have like a representation of the show in each one. And also Spiegelman was just really uncomfortable with having his part of the show at the Jewish Museum because he felt like it would become like, Masters of Comics and the Holocaust, and he didn't want that. So he eventually, they disagreed so badly that he actually pulled his work and everything that he loaned out of the show.
Oh, wow.
And it was filled in with Jerry Robinson's collection.
Right.
And Spiegelman still supported the show and took Michael Kimmelman of the New York Times for a tour and all that stuff. But it was really radically different than it was originally announced.
Then Trina kind of responded to the Master Show also, because she did a comics, an exhibition of women cartoonists at the Museum of Comic and Cartoon Art. Is that right? As a rebuttal in a way?
Yeah. So Trina, when the show opened at the Hammer in LA, Trina talked at the opening event and did her history of women cartoonists. The essay that I published in my book was actually the text of her talk. In New York, she showed her collection at that museum, which was like kind of a walk up on the third floor off Broadway. Did you guys ever see that museum?
No.
So it was like one big open room, and it was actually, they did a nice job. It was kind of equivalent to the Comic Art Museum here in San Francisco. She had a great show of her collection, and she spoke at the opening at the Jewish Museum about women cartoonists, because she had heard through the grapevine that Spiegelman said that there were no women cartoonists.
Oh, okay.
worth showing, and no historical women. So
sure.
Brian Walker and I have actually talked about this quite a lot. He said that he argued for Nell Brinkley.
Yeah.
But that didn't happen.
Yeah, actually, Jim brought Nell Brinkley to Michael Dooley's attention, and that started off a chain of events that had her included in the Eisner Hall of Fame. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that is cool. Trina was really happy about that. She did. When her Brinkley Girls book came out, that beautiful book she did with Fantagraphics, she actually did a show of her Brinkley collection at the Cartoon Art Museum here in San Francisco. And she had one thing that was very interesting was that women, young girls, collected Brinkley cartoons and scrapbooks and painted them themselves. So she'd have like 2 or 3 versions of Brinkley pages that had been painted in different ways by fans. So aside from Brinkley's own work, these kind of artist fan participation pieces were very interesting.
So now in the 2000 teens, it's pretty interesting. There's a bit of a celebration of some of the underground and kind of more artistic aspects of comic history, because you have Robert Crumb, underground comic art. There was a museum exhibit. Dennis Kitchen co-curated place works in the context of counterculture and the anti-war movement. So he kind of pushed storytelling in the exhibits as well as a historical background. So do you feel like there's, just different ways of showing comics? How do you feel about the way Dennis Kitchen did it in museums?
Well, actually, I'm really familiar with that show because Dennis and I had started a company together with another person, Jim Danke, who was one of the curators of that show, where we actually tried to find other places to tour that show to.
Mm-hmm. Oh, cool.
We didn't have luck at that point, but the idea was that we would, we had the underground classics, and also Dennis represents Eisner, El Cap, and
right.
Harvey Kurtzman.
Yeah.
So he has an incredible amount of work to draw from.
Yeah. And I liked his Al Cap quote where Al Cap says, yeah, 1 minute they're reading my stuff, the next minute they're wrapping fish in it.
Yeah. He was a satirical genius. It's really a shame that things wound up the way they did, because I mean his artwork is incredible, but we've pitched shows about Dennis has like the most incredible El Cap collection of anybody in the world, and every schmoo thing you can imagine. And people won't touch it with a 10-foot pole because of Cap's history.
Yeah, right? I know. Isn't that crazy? And he was a big deal back in the day.
Yeah. Well, and they're so well drawn. Plus, I mean, he had Franzetta and all, just like, it was amazing. So, it's really a shame. We actually pitched to the Schultz Museum. Cap had done a spoof of Peanuts and Schultz, and it turned out they hated each other so much that they wouldn't even consider it. But it was, it was too bad because they were like superstars of the era, and with all the merchandising and everything.
Absolutely, the merchandising. Yep. And then 2012, Art Spiegelman's private museum in Angoulême, and Dan Klaus's selections from Comics History in 2014, where these cartoonists are actually giving their own versions of comics history in exhibits. And that's an interesting thing, because now you have different ways of telling a history. Then in 2015, the Comic Book Apocalypse Graphic World of Jack Kirby at CSU in LA, curated by Charles Hatfield after his book Hand of Fire. And tell us, and I want to know this, and you, I think, would have a better explanation than me, but what's the difference between that exhibit, the 2015 Jack Kirby one, just culturally and what it means in general, versus, let's say, the early one in 1975? Like, why are they different as far as from a consciousness standpoint of appreciating Jack in the mainstream?
Well, for one thing, Jack was alive in 1975, right?
Yeah.
And he was still working and creating. So they were asking him, like, what do you want to show? I mean, he was actually involved in the exhibition. But Hatfield is like such a great Kirby scholar. He knows more about Kirby than anybody except his family, probably. But he had a great eye for the pieces to collect that were important and what really showed, what the Kirby style and the Kirby method of storytelling. So the way that show was laid out, there was a main room that had a lot of like sort of big splash pages and really fabulous pieces, and a whole wall of the collages, like the most collages I had ever seen in one place. And he also commissioned a couple big murals of the Silver Surfer and of Orion of the New God, so that you got like a really dramatic presentation. And then there were two galleries behind. And in one gallery, he had a complete issue of Commandy. So you could read the whole story. Yeah. And he had an iPad in that room so that you could see like some beginning sketches, and you could see the colored pages. So you could see the actual book as it was published while you were looking at the originals. And then he had another gallery that had a whole issue of Thor and had like gods and monsters like Devil Dinosaur and that kind of stuff. So it was really like an impressive retrospective.
Yeah.
And he had, there was one whole wall that had this incredible piece that he painted, Dream Machine. You know which one I'm talking about?
I practically lived there, Kim. I went like 6 or 7 times. I took my in-laws. That was amazing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I was really thrilled that I was able to reproduce that piece in my book. The Kirby show was another one that I thought was important enough that I included the 3 or 4 different viewpoints on it. There's an essay by Hatfield where he talks about his curatorial strategy. And then I have a couple art critics, one that's basically giving a tour of the exhibit by Doug Harvey that he wrote for Comix Journal, and then another one by an art historian that's tying Kirby into like the pop art movement. And
I would just say, Kim, the book that came out of it, the exhibit book that came out of it, also the talks and lectures, that because it was there for a long time, for a good amount of time, and there were events periodically, and that's as part of it as much as what's actually in the thing. The level of scholars that came and talked about it, which I went to, I think, every one of those. And so you would have people like Scott Buchatman, but you would have these like really diverse groups of voices all talking about Kirby on the same stage. And some were musicians that just were inspired. Some were academics. Glenn David Gold.
My favorite essay in the book is Mark Badger's essay.
Yeah.
About how Kirby uses perspective.
These 3 points that I just kind of want you to mention is, one, you mentioned that because of, let's say now it's after 2000 to 2020, there are changes that have happened as far as 2 main things. One, you mentioned the economy and gentrification has closed down some museums, and you mentioned the MOCCA in New York, as well as Geppi's Museum in Baltimore. A lot of his stuff is at the Library of Congress now. Then you also mentioned that the growing diversity of graphic novel art and the money that the comic films have made have caused the leftover museums to be more appreciative and showcase more comic art, where people can analyze erased pencil lines and whited out cleavage and things like that.
Yeah.
Tell us about this trend, like what's causing certain things to die off and certain things to be concentrated in this way?
Well, because of the popularity of the movies, first of all, exhibitions about superheroes, even though the major art museums aren't biting, a lot of science museums and museums that are starting to appear that are really specifically about pop culture are doing big superhero shows. I don't know if you guys got to see it, but there was that big Marvel show. This is the Doctor Strange room. There was that big Marvel show that happened and toured all over. Comic-Con is working on having a museum. I mean, they have a museum now, but they're still remodeling. The Lucas Museum of Narrative Arts is under construction. That's very interesting. They bought Crumb's whole Genesis. I mean, they could theoretically have a permanent exhibit of Crumb's Genesis. And there's the Museum of Pop Culture in Seattle. But on the whole, I think that a lot of the stigma about comics has kind of changed because the work has more value now in terms of like collectability and sales and everything. And, except for museums that are like really still kind of, diehard modernists, I think that a lot of museums are more flexible. They just want to bring in audiences. Mm-hmm. So if something is a blockbuster, like Spiegelman and Crumb's Genesis, those two toured all over Europe and Canada and into the US. And, I think that people realize that there are names in comics that can sell. In the show that I did at Society of Illustrators now, I have several 2020 Eisner winners that are like, New York Times bestsellers, like Hot Comb and My Favorite Thing is Monsters. And, it's just
we're going to get to that in a couple of minutes too. Yeah.
I want to address one other trend that you kind of alluded to, and I didn't get to talk about, the idea of narrative. So going back to Dennis Kitchen and kind of the stuff that he was writing about, narrative is really difficult in comic shows because obviously there's stories to be read. They're made to be, read in a book. So, people come and, they see a page, but might wonder, what's the rest of the story or something. So Dennis's way of dealing with this is to show short stories, like, 2 pages or, like if he's showing Eisner, he shows a story arc,
yeah,
like, 5 pages that show sort of a beat, you can go to the extreme. Like I talked with Spiegelman about showing his entire mouse. And he was like, I didn't expect everybody to read the entire book standing there in the museum. But what they did is they had a bench with a copy of Mouse at both ends. So people would look and they'd read, and they'd look and they'd read and walk around. And, Crumb's Genesis was overwhelming. I don't know if you guys saw that at the museum, but I saw it at the San Jose Museum of Art. And the way it was set up, they had like the beginning of the Adam and Eve story in a gallery by itself. And it ended with that beautiful drawing of the tree of life and all that stuff. And everybody read this really carefully and kind of oohed and hawed and everything. And then you looked around the corner and it just like stretched out forever. And there would be this audible gasp from people like, oh my God, how am I going to read all this?
A lot of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So in museum classes, they teach you that people are only going to read 250 words in a museum show. So it's like this weird thing to put text on the wall and figure out how much people are going to read. So you have to be kind of conscious. Like in the New York show, I kept to 4-page stories. And I think that's the best you can do.
And then the other thing, final thing, until the next section now is international. You had some cool international discussion. There was a 2011 Cartoon Art Gallery in Dubai, which is pretty interesting because they have their own like Middle East film and Comic-Con. That it's hard for sequential artists to make a living there. They have to deal with some degree of government censorship. And then also you mentioned Brazil. That they also had to kind of deal with kind of communist censors in like in the 1950s. Tell us about discussing like the international comic art museum scene and how are there differences from the United States from an overview?
Yeah, I think that the comics have a longer history in Europe particularly, but they were really different because in France in 1949, well, what am I trying to say?
Yeah, the law of 1949 where they couldn't do American comics for a while, right?
Yeah, well, basically what happened was comics were really popular in France, US comics. They were banned during the war, but people would like sneak scrapbooks in them and everything, and they were really highly valued. And that's part of the reason why the French fans were so passionate about them. After the war, US comics like flooded the market again. And then the French passed that law basically to grow the French comics industry. And at the time, the French hadn't like kept up with the US in terms of design and communication. They were still kind of Victorian and spidery looking. So it took them a while to catch up, but now obviously they're amazing French cartoonists. So it worked. But the guys that were like the comics clubs that were really like into comics in the 60s and kind of launched the whole exhibition thing were very much like the people that came out of the comics of the 40s and the war and all that stuff. Brazil is really interesting because they had the first international comics show and conference.
Yeah, that's right.
And that was 1951. And they did have to deal with some censorship especially because it's a very Catholic country. And, it was like a whole juvenile delinquency thing again. But they were very interesting because Professor De Moya, who wrote the essay in my book, who's unfortunately passed while the book was in publication. He wrote to all of these famous cartoonists and said, if you send me a piece of your work, I'll have a show in Brazil. And eventually they did. And they had a very intellectual thing where they talked about comics and film and sequential art and why it works the way it does. And, Eisner talked about that show throughout his career.
Yes.
He was really, really blown away by it.
That's great.
Yeah. But then, Japan is an amazing influence. The whole manga thing is so different from our concept of comics. The Dubai thing just fascinates me. And John Lent, who wrote that, who's the publisher of the International Journal of Comic Art, has actually been touring around all over Asia to museums and documenting them. In the latest issue, he has 2 great articles about art museums in China that are showing comic art. It's just fascinating. But comics doesn't happen in a bubble. They're everywhere. Obviously there are European museums. There's Angoulême, and there's the Great Comics Museum in Belgium, and comics are everywhere. It's great.
Yeah.
Did you go to the Tsuzuka exhibit in San Francisco?
I did. Actually, I wrote about it in my master's thesis.
That was fantastic. I still have my handbag from that. That was eye-opening to me and really changed my interest.
It was eye-opening for me, not just the selection that they had, which was pretty amazing because I didn't know the depth of Tsuzuka's catalog. But also it was really eye-opening in terms of display because they did a really good job using like the occasional blow up to emphasize something, or like some character that had a lot of detail or something. They also included a lot of finished pieces in it. So they'd have like 4 things and then they'd have the finished comic. They used film really well. They had a projection on one wall with Kimba the White Lion and all that stuff.
Oh,
so
I remember that exactly. Yeah.
You could actually see all that. I thought they did a great job on that exhibit. It was one of the best comics exhibits I'd seen up to that point.
That's what I was thinking. It's still one of my favorites that I've ever been to.
Yeah. I wish it would have toured, it was great, but it didn't.
We've talked about the exhibits and the museums. Maybe for just a few minutes we talk about, because one of the concepts of your book is that it be how comics art gained recognition as art, and there are other ways it happened besides museums and things. So let's just kind of go through those a little bit. One of them that's mentioned is Jules Feiffer's book, which also has a really special place in my heart. Talk about that for a minute.
Well, all of those shows that happened in the 70s, the ones that published a catalog, I went through their bibliographies, and most of them credit that book in History of the Comic Strip. But the Feiffer book is really interesting. There's a show that happened at the Art Institute of Chicago called, I'm spacing out at the moment, it'll come to me. But it was a fine art show of Peter Saul and people that were doing really kind of really abstract sort of pop art that was sort of surreal. But the curator used Feiffer's book as kind of the underpinning to be able to talk about all of the things that the artists were doing in their paintings and everything. And I just think that book had a big influence because after the pop art era, a whole new group of people were really curious about comics, and most of the books that were out were out of print. So Feiffer's book was a real breakthrough because it really brought that history to mind again. And he's such a great artist himself that his commentary was really good too. So
and he had instant, he just, because he's of a different moment of that time, he instantly gives it all credibility just by his very association with it.
Right. there was that, and then the history of the comic strip was kind of like that came out in '68. So Feiffer was '65. So the two of them were kind of companions in most of these shows in the '70s.
Now, you also talked about the IDW collections.
Yeah.
Where they're almost like little mini museums within themselves. Talk about that and how it's different, and what that really allows people that don't get to go to these. As you mentioned, not everything tours. What did the IDW books do in terms of accelerating the appreciation of it as art as compared to just stories that you read through?
Yeah, well, so where that essay came from, that essay is written by Andre Molitou, who's an art historian at like the University of Indiana or something. He's actually a Kirby specialist too, he talks at Comic-Con fairly often. I have two essays by him. The first essay is about seeing comics as an art object. He wrote this right after Masters of Comics in 2005 and presented it at a convention that really serves like the market of art historians and art history teachers and studio art teachers. And it was about gallery comics.
Oh, yeah. I want to talk about that in a few minutes too.
Okay, well, to get to your point. So I published Andre's article, and he really didn't have time to do an update. And when I went back after peer review to do an edit, I invited him to do an update. So he wrote this update about Commandy and Hatfield show, and also about the IDW books and how there's such a great reproduction of like the real thing. It's almost like a museum experience, but you can take your time with it. So it's not like you're standing there in the gallery and, your feet are hurting and you're just like, oh my God, this is so much to look at. You can take your time and really see every detail and everything. And, I think that Andre did a really good job of pointing out, like, if you're looking at something on the wall and you're looking at something in a book, even with the IDW books, your eye is drawn to different things. Like when you're seeing a piece framed on the wall, your eye is drawn to action or like diagonals or some thing about the drawing that draws your eye. And then you look at the rest and you take in the dialogue and everything. But, in the IDW books, you're reading again. So your eye might be drawn to some key part of the drawing, but you're much more likely to actually read the thing and digest it all.
And that's what happens, I think, is with those, you start off appreciating as art, but like a lot of things in comics, by the time you get to the 5th page, you're trapped by the narrative and you start going through it to read it, rather than to study it in terms of the form.
Yeah, that's my experience with these things. I have a Walt Simonson Thor one that I just love. And, my experience with these is I look through them first just to like gorge on the artwork. And then I go back and like, read it carefully and really study the detail. But, I think that those books are wonderful.
And that's a perfect segue for me to go to that first is it Molitou?
Andre Molitou.
Molitou. Yeah. And maybe I was reading it wrong, but it presents the issue of what you're looking at on the wall and the difference between that. And it seemed to me that he was talking about the aesthetic beauty of the art to some degree, that's what you're looking at and what you're drawn to when they're framed like that. Yeah. And I felt like that's true, but and I'm going to talk about it in terms of film studies because that's my background. It seemed to me that he was looking at it in a Bazin mise en scène, deep focus kind of a way, that it's about the picture there on the frame. And I reject that a little bit in that I think there's also room for it to be an Eisensteinian montage aspect to it. When I'm looking at whole pages, especially like with the Kirby, but in so many, I'm looking at it by how interesting it is, the panel progression and how everything on the page relates to each other. Not because I'm caught in the story, but because I'm caught in the form. And I think, that's what someone, like understanding comics or McLeod might say too. I think to just in his analysis, I thought he was just talking about the pretty pictures framed more than about the form of comics. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
In a way, I think that might be a little true. Andre is a total art historian. I mean, he writes about 18th century art, and he actually, the first time that I saw Andre present at Comic-Con, he was doing Kirby and modern art, and he was showing Kirby with all of these abstract expressionist paintings and showing similarities between abstract paintings and Kirby's machines and the movement in them and everything. So he's definitely looking at comics pages as artworks first. And I think that was the goal of his piece. And the reason why I wanted to reprint it is I wanted to give people another tool to be able to talk about artwork on the wall and why it works the way it does. But it's true that he's definitely looking at it as artwork first and narrative second.
That's interesting, because what I would say, and I would use Andy Warhol as an example, where if you go and you're looking at the soup cans and you're looking at that on the wall, and then you go into the next room and they're screening Empire, and you sit down and you just watch that for 20 minutes or so, it's still, those are both the same museum installation, and you're just doing, one is doing it in a different way, but it's really not a distinction very much. To me, they're both art.
In a way that's what Charles Hatfield did with his show. He had a main room that was Kirby's greatest hits and the collages, and they were all amazing drawings where it was one page of Fantastic Four that was incredible or whatever, I mean, you were definitely just looking at the drawing. But then, the next gallery was Kamandi, and you were definitely reading that whole book on the wall.
Working through, I didn't see anybody just look at it and then move on. They went from page to page.
Yeah, because it's a story that you get really involved in. I actually got Terry when his bug died. I mean, it was really involving, and I was right there with him.
That just means you have a soul, because who wouldn't cry when that grasshopper dies?
That's one reason why I was glad Andre actually in his update in my book writes about Kamandi and compares it with the artist edition, and the different things that he looked at and the emotional way that he connected with it. I think that's I guess what I'm trying to say is museum exhibits aren't one thing. I mean, you really look at the piece of artwork that you're dealing with and have to say, okay, how is the audience going to relate to this? What are they going to look at? What are they going to see? So, you can present a whole story like Kamandi that's very involving and know that the audience is going to look at all that and get it. And sometimes it's just a beautiful drawing, and you have to figure that the audience is just going to take it that way.
Now, I'm going to roll the canon part into the final part of your museum, the curating job that you did with the current artists and things. But I do want to leave room for one thing, one story I loved in your book that I think sums up the importance of all of this. And that's that Charles Schultz story about him. Yeah. Could you tell that to us?
Okay, so this is 1934. Let me think for a minute. I actually have the newspaper that he saw. This is 1934. Charles Schultz was, I think, like 12 years old or 11 years old. He was trying to learn how to draw comics by copying the King Features comics that were in the St. Paul Pioneer newspaper. And there were like 10 comic strips like Skippy and some wartime comics. And his mom was trying to help him with this whole thing. And she noticed that the St. Paul Library was having a display of original comic art by all of the artists that he was seeing in the St. Paul Pioneer, plus sketches by 2 or 3 movie stars and, other stuff to like draw.
Like Gary Cooper was one of them. Yeah.
Yeah. So he had like this epiphany because, it was the Depression. So he wasn't actually using like real drawing paper. He was drawing on like the shirt back. They used to put like cardboard in men's shirts when they came back from the cleaners.
Sure.
He was drawing on those. And he was really nervous about like, making mistakes, and he was very uptight. So he went to this show, and there were blotches and registration marks and whiteout, and also like just the passion in the drawing. He saw like the brush strokes and, how people were really drawing, like, the same strips that he had copied, he was able to see like the originals. And it just changed his whole outlook on it. He talked about this at the DeYoung Museum in 1992, and just like glowed while he was talking about what a formative experience this was for him.
When I read that, all I could think was how many people that we don't know, that we know as artists, that we don't know that they went to one of those museums or they. And I mean, I remember going to the Masters and seeing those giant Gary Panter pictures, and just what that did to me, because I wasn't that familiar with his work, and what that changed again how I think about comics to some degree. I had my students look at Will Eisner's Reign versus Jack Kirby's Reign and just go back and forth, and those kinds of things you can't get from the comic. You have to get that by doing it, in a museum setting.
Yeah, well, there's a couple things. First of all, for people that are interested in being cartoonists, there's something about the sort of validation of going to a museum and having an artist on the wall and, this is important, that somebody picked this and put all this money into a show and the public is there looking at it. There was a big Rube Goldberg show in San Francisco recently, and they not only showed like a huge range of Goldberg's work, which blew me away because I had no idea like the depth of his career. Right. But upstairs, they actually had a show of artist contraptions that were like artists that made machines that were like driven by gravity or that you would crank or whatever. And they had, a display of Goldberg's contraption cartoons, but also just like these incredible machines. So it was great to sort of see the continuity of it, but as I've interviewed different artists about shows and included artists in shows, there's always some story about, I saw work by so-and-so in a museum show and it was just incredible. And sometimes it's not another comic artist. Sometimes it's fine art. Like I'll be talking tomorrow night at an artist talk with Emil Ferris, who's everybody's favorite thing is monsters. The Chicago Arts Institute is like another character in that show. She just like re-renders the paintings and adds so much meaning to them and draws so much for out of it for her book. Like she can kind of like enter the paintings, and like there are places where she talks about she goes in a basement and says, this basement smells like Matisse, and what does that mean? So it's just seeing like real artwork is such an incredible influence on other artists and people that are just trying to get their creativity going, that it's just so important.
We just talked to Professor Foster about, African American and comics, went through a whole thing on that. And Dwayne McDuffie is obviously important in that. And then also there's a Static Shock show that's going to be produced soon.
Right.
So tell us what caused you to have his essay that was actually, I think, written in the 90s about
92.
African American, 92, right? Yeah, about African American comics. How did that fit there, and why did you include that?
As near as I can tell from my research so far, that was the first show that actually focused exclusively on Black cartoonists. It was at the Cartoon Art Museum in San Francisco in 1992. And his intro was just so touching about this childhood story of, playing basketball with his friend, and they were excited because there was like some matchup between the Hulk and the mighty Thor coming out in some comic, and that they raced over there, but that comic was sold out. But he discovered Black Panther and what a huge difference that representation made to him as a little boy. That Wakanda was like this incredible civilization, and Black people did everything from like, scientist to street sweeper, that he expressed so well how this opened up a whole new world for him. And I just felt like, it was a Cartoon Art Museum catalog that's like, a booklet that's been out of print for like, a couple decades. So I didn't think that people would be able to see it again. So I really wanted to get that story out, because I just thought that it was such a meaningful description of, it was one of the reasons why he launched his career in comics. And I just wanted it to be available to people.
That's great.
As we go through this next thing, Trina was the curator for for one half of the exhibit, and you were curator for the other half, or was it more working together than that?
I was kind of the overall organizer. Trina's like in her 80s. And basically what happened is Trina has her collection in a bunch of file drawers in her house. And I went to her house over like 3 or 4 days and dug stuff out of her file cabinets, and we talk about it together and be, yes, I like that, or no, I like that, or you can show that one, but you have to show the whole story, or, there was a whole conversation about it. So, Trina definitely had a big hand in curating her collection and, what pieces we're showing. And obviously she knows the history of women cartoonists and the importance of these pieces better than anybody. So yes, Trina, the gallery is 2 floors, and the whole first floor is Trina's collection, starting with Nell Brinkley in like 1911 and going through the 70s. Like we've got whole stories by Lily Renee, and a whole romance novel, or a whole romance comic by Valerie Barclay, and a whole Camilla Queen of the Jungle story by Marcia Snyder. And it's just like an incredible array of stuff. Down on the second floor, when you come down the stairs, the first thing you walk up to is a wall of underground comics from Trina's collection that's from early women's comics, particularly All Girl Thrills #1, which was like 1971. That's work by Trina and Julie Goodvibes and Barbara Mendez. And then there's 20 contemporary artists where I wanted to show if people had a 4-page story, I would show a whole story, or there's 4 pages from a book, or just 4 splash pages. It depended a lot on the artist. But there's 20 artists in different genres.
So that's interesting. So, because Trina obviously is a historian, right? Where she is, where she discusses over the history of women in comics, and there are some parallels with the Foster interview and the Trina interview, and that's a very strong passion, especially among other things. She's written a lot of stuff. Does her passion for it show in the exhibit? I mean, does it shine in the exhibit the way it does in her writings?
I think so. She has a new book out called Flapper Queens that just came out from Fantagraphics. I think it's sold out already, actually. Mm-hmm. And she's got another book that's coming out in January about Mopsy, about Gladys Parker. But I think that Trina's passion for collecting shows up. I mean, she's got very interesting stuff. Dale Misick, who did Brenda Starr.
Yes.
Trina has a lot of unpublished work by her of early strips that she tried that weren't succful before Brenda Starr, like Mimi the Mermaid and Streetline Babies and all that stuff.
Of Dale Misick stuff. Yeah.
One of the things that I think really comes through in Trina's part of the show is Trina's interest in fashion.
Oh yeah.
Because most of the pieces that she shows, the women are like dressed to the nines. I mean, It's incredible, and it's all like in that period, like Flapper Fanny and Nell Brinkley and Lily Renee and all of these women really paid attention to style.
Yeah. And so in their comic art, they would have like some of the latest fashions in their comic art.
Yeah. So it's a real time capsule too. When you're going around the room, you can really get an idea of how women dressed and presented themselves in that era. Plus Trina has a pretty good collection of black and white photos of most of the artists, and we have those around so that you can actually see what they look like.
And those are hard to find. That's great that she has them with the art there for people to look at. That's unique, and that's great.
Yeah.
So now, as far as you mentioned Lily Renee, there is that Lily Renee kind of 20-minute like documentary on her that David Armstrong was kind of shown around. Does it discuss any of the personal lives of these artists and like her encounter with escaping the Holocaust? Is that discussed in the museum, or is it more of a showcase of the artwork?
No, it's definitely focused on the artwork. I mean, we've jammed so much work in there.
Yes, it's like there's only so much you can put.
There's not a lot. Sort of the way that the museum dealt with this is they have a small screening room. So they're showing the documentary She Draws Comics downstairs.
Right.
And people are actually very interested in watching that. So, Lily's story is part of that.
And is there some discussion of, I know that Trina mentions this, is that there is a lot of women in comics during the World War II era because a lot of the men were drafted to war. And so then they were filling in a lot of the shoes. And then unfortunately, they were almost kind of shoved back out when the men came back in like 1945 to get their jobs back. And so it's like they kind of go away for a while, but then with the kind of civil rights and women's lib movement, you see more of it popping through. Or is some of this, any of that is that kind of explained at all? Or is it, how does that
it is a little bit. And there were still some women working in like sort of marginalized genres, like romance comics.
Like romance for sure. Yes.
Yeah. In the 50s. And the show goes on like into the 70s where women are doing comic strips again. And there's a big, there's a lot of Ramona Fradon's work for DC, Aquaman and
sure.
Plastic Man and some work by Marie Severin.
Yeah, Marie Severin, sure.
But I think the one weakness of the show is that there isn't a lot of didactic wall panels, really, because the society just wanted to get like as much work as they could on the walls. And
makes sense. Yeah, and really, I think a lot of people that are going to be impressed with what they're seeing, the visual and the context of
Yeah,
putting
I
kind of
mean,
the older and the
there's enough. I mean,
contemporary.
you know, there's like a paragraph here
Sure.
and there, like, you
And I
know,
think probably
this
for
is
like the people coming through, they're going to try to absorb so much that they might even feel a little overwhelmed, but in a good way.
yeah.
So I want to talk about the 20 that you got that you worked with. Now, did you interact with all 20 of them, or were some of them where they just sent you some materials?
I talked to a few people, like Karen Green and John Lind and some other, like, New York comics specialists that I know, and kind of got a idea of who the New York audience might be interested in, because
that's interesting.
Originally this show was supposed to open on April 11th, and the big opening and all of the speaker events were happening during Mocha Fest, which is the big the Comics Independent Comics Festival. I wanted artists that would be appealing to that audience. I had to be careful not to repeat people, like the Society had just done a big show of Women of the New Yorker, for instance, so I don't show a lot of New Yorker cartoons.
That explains a couple of notable absences. That totally makes sense to me now.
Yeah. So, I got lots of graphic novels and really thought about people. And I wanted to be sure that I had a diverse range of genres. I wanted to be sure that I had like a lot of different voices, to make sure that I kind of got like a good sort of, racial, what am I trying to say? That there was a lot of diversity in the show.
People like Trinidad Escobar, which a lot of people might not be.
And Ebony Flowers and Afua Richardson and Alethea Martinez, people that are just doing like fascinating stuff, like World of Wakanda.
And amazing, because some of them you would say, oh yeah, well, recent Marvel artists, like that's not what you would in times past ever have said, but because of the Wakanda stuff, some of these artists are working at Marvel in a way you would not expect them to be.
Yeah, well, and actually, I mean, the two of them, Afua and Alethea, have had a pretty long careers at Marvel, and have done some DC comics too. But World of Wakanda just really put them on the map. They got Eisners for those, and the work Afua is an incredible cover artist. That main poster that we have of Shuri and Storm is by her. And Alethea just did a really interesting free comic for DC that's like sort of a based loosely on the New York bird watching incident.
Right. I've seen that.
Yeah. So we're doing an artist talk on Monday, actually, and she's going to be talking about that.
Well, let's break them down a little bit. When I was looking at the list and thinking about it, it seemed like there were not just diversity categories, but also there was very much their area of interest, or who publishes them or whatever. Because like you have the first, second kids, the ones that are working in children or young adult stuff. And yet, I say this on podcasts constantly, that's one of the most exciting areas that there is in comics right now.
Yeah, I agree. Well, and also, what's happening in this show is kind of a generational story, because I've got, like pioneers like Willie Mendez has a new book out that's like her whole creation story called Queen of the Cosmos. And then there's like I've got Joyce Farmer and Lee Mars. And then there's like kind of a second generation that came in the 70s and 80s, like Carol Tyler and Mary Fleener and Fiona Smith, the Canadian artist. And then, there are all the new artists that are just, doing incredible work. But it was very interesting to me how diverse the work has gotten in terms of themes and the kind of stories that people tell. I mean, it used to be, you would have like superhero comics and, maybe there would be like, I don't know, some other topic. But now anything goes. People write about anything they're passionate about. It's pretty amazing.
Well, I think what's great about the exhibit in total is the fact that you can go in and you can look at Nell Brinkley and then go upstairs and see Wang's Prince and the Dressmaker art. Yeah. And realize it's all part of the same. I mean, those two are the perfect like beginnings and current in my mind, because the Prince and the Dressmaker, for anybody that likes comics, no matter what you're interested, that's just one of the prettiest books and most moving books.
Well, and Colleen Doran's book just blows me away. The Snow Glass Apples.
Yes,
her work is just amazing.
So you were saying that you only used a few pages, and the first one that came to my mind when you said that I thought, what a frustration that would have to be, would be the Credo Willberg's piece.
Yeah.
So you only used a couple, and we should say, because people aren't going to be familiar with that.
Well, graphic medicine. I think that graphic medicine is such a interesting and growing genre in comics that I really wanted to be sure that it was represented, and her work is so beautiful. We're actually showing 5 pieces by her because a couple of them were small. We also have a display case where we're showing some of her needlepoint, where she actually embroiders like slide cultures of cells and stuff. and it's just fascinating work. So I was really glad to include her.
And Tillie Walden is also one of my favorites in terms of the newer people. And
yeah, she's one person. She's one person I didn't have a lot of direct communication with. I don't know any details. I've mostly worked with her agent on this.
I think she stays busy collecting Eisners.
Yeah, beautiful work. I was glad to have her.
And let's talk about Carol Tyler. Just for a minute, because that's important both to
you guys
this
are going to
exhibit.
Interview her soon, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's important both in terms of the comic art, but also her work is another one that is almost a museum within itself, a historical museum, but it's so important in the way that she does that. And so let's talk about that just for a second.
Yeah, well, there's 2 things. I did an extensive interview with Carol in my book about the show that she did around the work of Soldier's Heart, the story of her trying to figure out like what happened to her dad in World War II and why he was still acting the way that he does, which is also blended in with her whole personal story of her family and everything. She in that show, one of the fascinating things about it was she shows all of the pages of Soldier's Heart hanging from a clothesline as kind of a Midwestern thing. So they're kind of like in the breeze of the air conditioner waving. And then the second part of the gallery, you actually walk through a cutout of her head into all of this like memorabilia from her family and her dad's workshop and all of that stuff. So that was a very interesting presentation. But Carol likes to make things. So in our show, she has 2 regular like traditional comics pages. Then she has a page, a story that's etched on saw blades. And she has another story with like little panels and everything that's etched into found wood strips from her farm that are like arranged on like a plaque.
That reminds me that one thing I wanted to emphasize on this is that it is all women, and so there's something collective in relation to that's really special in this exhibit. But also, women comic artists seem like they are more open to experiment in different forms besides on the page, that whether it's using embroidery or whether it's we interviewed Mary Fleener, and she's always playing with material and Linda Berry, obviously, incredible example. And that, I don't think that translates nearly as much with men as it does, where they may paint and they may draw, but I think that the willingness to do all these different like bring art into crafts and combine them in a comics form is really interesting.
Well, I think that it's been a tradition for women that, making things,
Sure.
Craft, needlework, dinner, whatever it is.
Mary did that quilt, did the page on the quilt.
Yeah. I just think that it's women grow up like doing a lot of different things as part of their creativity, and I think that a lot of things get incorporated. Also, I think that because so much artwork is digital now, like there's 3 or 4 artists in the show that work like exclusively digitally. I think that they need to like do other stuff to break out of that, to give them like the hands-on art experience. So I feel like there's a lot of experimentation with different mediums, and I wanted to be sure to show that.
So are there any, the show certainly didn't get the audience that it would have because of this. Is there a book associated with it? Is there going to be anything? I have a pretty extensive section on my website that like sort of explains the concepts behind the show and has exhibit photos and the all the artist bios and all of that. Can you give us the direction to get there so that the listeners can?
It's neuroticraven.com.
Neuroticraven.com, which I know, but
all one word.
Yes.
And there's actually in the upper navigation, there's a link for women in comics, so it's easy to find. I wish there was a publication. It's kind of up in the air right now because of COVID, but I'm actually negotiating with the U.S. State Department in Rome to remount the show in Rome in May, and they're interested in doing a catalog, but they're having another COVID surge in Italy right now, and I think they're really nervous about like making a commitment. So they're kind of waiting to see what's happening. So I'm like, I hope if that happens and the gallery is big enough to, mount the same show all over again, I hope to do a catalog with them.
Oh, that would be great. Because that's what's needed. Right? We need a catalog on this.
Yeah.
Okay. Alex?
Well, this has been a fun episode of the Comic Book Historians podcast, looking at the history of comic art in museums, as well as modern displays in museum exhibitions. Kim Munson, thank you so much. You're awesome, and this book really achieved something that I haven't seen published before. That we actually know it hasn't. This is the first time it's been done. First time, yeah. So it's an honor chatting with you today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I hope to see you guys in person at another convention soon.